Like, I remember going there when I was 17, and like what I knew about science, you could probably fit in a teacup. And like I was in presenting to a conference of 1,000 people, some people who had worked in the field for 20 and 30 years, some of them who worked in labs with like Nobel Prize winning scientists. Like these were credentialed people. And after it over, you have conversations with all of these people. Nobody talks to each other differently based on the credentials. And if you say something, no one says something like, well, let me see your degree. And if you were ever to do that, like everyone else would look at you like you just said the stupidest thing in the world. Like if someone criticized someone else and they said, well, you don't actually have a degree, it'd be like, okay, that has nothing to do with anything. Is what he said
So
true
it,
or false?
so it should be really easy to explain why I'm wrong then.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so there was a lot of that going on tonight, and it just is.
Yeah, I just
I
find
don't
that.
have time for it. Like, talk about a real issue, please. You know.
I can see non-scientists saying it, but like when actual academics do it, like I don't know. I just find it sad. Maybe it's the institutions and the way they were educated or whatever. But like,
Mm.
and that's such a strong topic. Like one of the things that Feynman, who's one of the greatest physicists, arguably of all time, easily in the last century, said, the foundation of science is the disbelief in the position of being an expert.
That's great.
And he's one of the greatest physicists of all time, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Cool. I like that, and I guess that's kind of that's really relevant to what I'm saying too, because it's kind of the attitude I'm encountering a lot. Like, I know what science is and you don't. Therefore, we could talk about whatever you want, but just understand it's not scientific because you don't know what science is and I do. Like, that's just the whole attitude. It's like, I could talk about intelligent design if I want, but let's make it clear we're not talking about science here.
The funny thing is, about any, I've never heard anyone say that actually knew what science was. Because when you actually study science and when you actually do it, you realize one of the hardest problems would be to try to figure out how you could actually decide if something was scientific or not. Like it's called the
Mm-hmm.
open demarcation problem for that reason, because it's unsolved. Like you can look at something and you can walk into a lab, me and you can be working, and you could walk in and say, okay, Cliff, what are you at? We could talk about it for a while. And you could make suggestions on how my methods would become more reliable. That's one of the things you go to
Mm-hmm.
conferences and you talk to people to learn about how they're doing, if they're doing something similar to you, and you exchange methods. But
Mm-hmm.
like, it's not a switch. It's not like you weren't doing science before they gave you that suggestion.
Yeah. And it's kind of I think you were explaining this in another hangout one time. Science is kind of there is a range of science. It's something more or less scientific. And I think what that really comes down to is what degree of confidence do we have that a proposition is true? And that is the important question to me, not whether we can arbitrarily apply some label to an idea. Like, science is just kind of becoming a label for some people, where science is just a process of determining which things are true. It's epistemology.
And the funny thing is, I mean, and again, a lot of this thing strikes me as sad, another, depending on how I think about it. Like when I did my bachelor's, when you're doing that, basically you're learning a lot of stuff. Like, you obviously, like everyone, I can't imagine someone would say that wasn't scientific. It's a peer-reviewed document. It's done like in a lab, surrounded by other scientists. It gets external reviewers. So it would seem to have to be science. But I mean, when I was doing my master's and I look back up on my bachelor's work, I was like, what was I thinking when I wrote this up? This is like horribly ignorant. Almost every way I did something was like really wrong. And I was like really embarrassed to read through it. But like, this was my first attempt at doing a real experiment. How do you
Yeah.
think it's going to turn out after you spend another 2 years learning the method? But I mean, it was still science at some
Uh-huh.
level. It just wasn't very good science.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I read some research in the past year or past 2 years about children and the way that they form conclusions. And the research seemed to show that even children um, utilize methods of reasoning that resemble standard scientific methods of reasoning. So, what do you think about that, Cliff? Like, could you actually say that children are being scientific in a sense? Would you go that far?
Yeah, I have like a really loose definition of science, which is what gets me like in real conflicts with people like Steve and Matt, because they have like textbook definitions of science, and like mine is because I actually do it. And so, so to me, like you look at how one of the greatest things is to look at some of the early childhood developments of how children actually come to understand about the world, because children learn things about the world that are not told to them. They just infer it. Children, for example, figure out cause and effect, what it means. And I don't know what cause and effect
Yeah.
means, like those terms, but
Even
they understand the
infants.
concept. Yeah.
Yeah, like I've got a 1 year old, and like I just wonder what's going on in her brain, in her first few months of life. Like, how does she figure out that firing neurons in her brain a certain way makes her hand move, in a certain way, like intentionally in a certain direction,
Yeah. And it's all experiment, right?
even
So,
at that
like,
basic level?
yeah. So when children are born, really, really young children don't realize their physical body, like their hands and feet, are connected to themselves. So, like, they flail around and they don't often recognize their own hands. But it doesn't take them very long at all to recognize that because they're in the dark inside, right? But once they get out into the world, they can start connecting the fact that their hands are connected to themselves. And then they start, actually manipulating the environment around them. This is really, really quickly, but it
Mhm.
takes them a while to understand cause and effect, because you can do something like to really this only happens in a couple of months, though they can figure this out. Like, you take an orange ball in your hand and you put it in front of a baby, and you just hold the orange ball there. Now you move the ball behind your back so the baby can't see it, and in your other hand you have a blue ball, and you take the blue ball out. A really young baby doesn't react to that. It has no problem with the fact that an orange ball became a blue ball. Doesn't
Mhm.
make any difference to it, like orange, blue, whatever. Law of identity doesn't mean anything to a newborn baby. But it only takes them a very short period of time. It's only a matter of months. When you watch the baby's eyes, you can see a pupil dilation response when the blue ball comes out, because you're like, what the hell? That was a yellow ball and now it's a blue ball. Like, what's going on, buddy? And they'll react to it right away because they figured out the law of identity. They figured out the cause and effect. Now, they don't know any of these terms, but they
No.
understand them already.
Yeah, exactly. There's a you reminded me of object permanence there. Um, there's a onion video. You know what the onion is? You ever
Yeah.
read yeah. So they've got this video about object permanence, and it's something like U.S. college students lag behind in basic object permanence. It's got a bunch of students like sitting at tables, and like some experimenters like hiding objects behind a piece of paper, and they're like, what? Like they interview some college students that say ridiculous things like, if I can't see it anymore, how do I know it's even still there? You gotta check it out. You'd appreciate that. But yeah, like it just seems so stupid to me that, I mean, you're not really demarcating science. When somebody talks about falsifiability or credentials or whatever, you're not really demarcating science. You're just demarcating a certain level of confidence about a certain conclusion. But it's all scientific because it's all like on a path of, it's all epistemic.
I
Yeah.
think what you just said there is the most critical part that people miss. You're on a path.
Mhm.
Science is about a progression. One of the if I was to demarcate science at all, it would be that you would remove that. If
Yeah.
you remove
Mhm.
that and you take positions of absolute, which you do not allow to be modified by any external influence or any internal influence, I think it would be hard pressed for me to say you're doing science at that point.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. Totally.
But the other things don't. I mean, like Matt Bell was screaming at a bunch of people earlier today that one of the key things about science is that other people have to be able to repeat your experiments, and that is something that it's taught like in junior high, and they throw that at you. But just think about that. Like, what about if you were the only person alive? Does that mean science then
Mhm.
can't exist? That
Right.
seems kind of silly, right? What
Yeah.
about if you only found like a new material and it was the only one sample that you ever had of that material? Then you can only
Mhm.
do one experiment on it. You
Yeah.
can never find another sample of material. But you do the experiment in as most rigorous a way that you can, knowing everything that you do about methodology, but that's not scientific because it can never be repeated. That seems kind of silly.
Yeah. Absolutely. It does. Yeah. And also, it's like, how is it that science or the progress of knowledge depends on a single methodology, a single specific methodology? Like, aren't there many ways of acquiring knowledge? Aren't there many ways of acquiring confidence about conclusions, not just one or two? Like, I have this problem with falsifiability. Like, a lot of people say that a proposition has to be falsifiable or else it's not scientific. And as you well know, that was Popper's big thing.
Yeah.
Um, I just don't really think that makes it an idea unscientific, even if it's unfalsifiable, because you can still make a positive case for something. Like if you can't falsify something, it doesn't mean you can't correlate cause with effect. Like I don't see how you can make a principled statement that just because it's falsifiable means you can no longer acquire any knowledge about it. And if
Right.
you can acquire knowledge, how is that not scientific?
And the easiest way for me to think about any of these issues when people take hard stances, they're almost always wrong. Like, I think falsification is a great aspect to bring into work if you can. By all means, if you can, you should investigate it. But, like, I'm going to provide a counterexample which seems absurd. Albert Einstein is recognized as one of the greatest physicists of all time. He's obviously a scientist, right? No one would dispute that that man was a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, if you look at when he did his general theory of relativity, it came about because he was thinking about um, the experience that you have when you go up into an elevator. When an elevator accelerates upward, you feel heavy. And he asked himself, if I couldn't see the elevator, like if the elevator was really big, like it was big enough that the entire world was in this elevator, the entire universe was in this elevator, and the elevator was just accelerating up, is there any experiment that I could do that could tell I was in an elevator versus just being in a heavier gravitational field? And he couldn't think on one. And he said, well, if you can't distinguish them, that should mean I should be able to write the entire theory of gravity based on it being an acceleration versus it being a force. And he wrote up this theory about acceleration being what gravity was versus it being a force. And it's a general theory of relativity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he had no way to falsify this. If you think about it, right, what he said is, I can't tell if it's an acceleration or it's a force, and there's no experiment that you could do to say which one of these two things it was. So that can't be falsified because of the way that he actually framed it.
Yeah.
Would anyone ever say that that man wasn't doing science?
Yeah, I
See what I
don't
mean?
think so.
That's ridiculous to
Steve might
say.
say it.
Yeah, and it would be absolutely ridiculous to say Albert Einstein wasn't a scientist, that he wasn't doing scientific work, that this theory, when it was produced and published and peer reviewed, and it's known now as one of the landmark. Now, eventually, later on, people did find out a way to actually falsify it, and they made a whole bunch of observations. But this was like years later
Oh
that
yeah.
they figured this out.
Initially, it was still even testable, right? I mean, he made predictions and stuff. Like, falsifiability is not the only way to test an idea.
No, I think the thing that I think that's important, and if people would just realize what you said earlier, that science is supposed to be about a path. Feynman said it like the way he thought about it was that imagine an onion, and as you peel back the layers of an onion, that's what he said science was. It's about progress, about peeling back the layers. Now he said maybe you'll never be able to get all the layers. Maybe you'll never get all the way through it. But it's that continuous process that you're always peeling back the layers. When you stop doing that, I don't think you're doing science anymore. But if
Yeah.
you're willing to do that, like if Einstein was just okay, this is my theory, and I'm not going to accept any criticisms of it. This is right because
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Then that's not scientific. But that's the thing to me. Like that's the only demarcation that I've ever been able to come up with that would demarcate something from not being scientific.
Yeah. I think that's the only demarcation I've ever heard, too, that I would agree with. Because that's what it's all about. It's not about some kind of arbitrary label. It's about, are you learning about reality? Are you acquiring knowledge? It's like the only thing that matters. It doesn't, it doesn't matter if it's falsifiable. Can you acquire knowledge in spite of that?
It's the same way where people are predicated 100% that if it's not peer reviewed and published, then they're
Yeah,
not going to think about it.
that's
And
another.
like that's another thing where I can say that's great. So if you show me a paper that's peer reviewed and published, then there's basically another check mark that I can tick, which gives this
Mhm.
basically a confidence that I have in this because it's gone through the peer review process.
Mhm.
But for example, um, there's people that I know uh, in various fields. They could be hunters, wilderness guides, fishermen, whatever. They have a tremendous wealth of knowledge, practically, about what they do, about, for example, how the weather affects fishing patterns, how various baits use, about how boats work in various currents, that kind of stuff. A
Mhm.
tremendous amount of stuff. None of it's peer reviewed and published. But isn't it kind of silly to say because it's not peer reviewed and published that there's no value or there's no utility in what these people would say, like, and that they
Yeah,
don't know anything about the external world? Doesn't that seem like it'd be a little bit silly?
it is silly. It's really silly. Well, the silly thing to me is that people think that peer review is the only way to acquire objective knowledge. I think that's the main thing there is objectivity, like demonstrating that what you observed or your conclusions are ascertainable outside of just yourself. But I don't think that you have to be peer reviewed to achieve that. You know, like you notice certain. I don't know very much about the example you used, but like wildlife does certain things around certain times of year. So you notice the seasons are changing. So then you go out looking for these behaviors in the wildlife at that time of year, and lo and behold, your experience in the past turned out to be predictive of the future. So I would say that's kind of objective in a way because like nature independently confirmed your experience from the past that this is a pattern. It might not be the greatest example, but the point is it doesn't take peer review in standard journals to acquire objective knowledge, I don't think. Actually, I mean, what did they do before journals?
Yeah, I was just
Like
gonna say,
like
like,
independent people did the same experiment.
yeah, like if you take these positions, it becomes ridiculous because what you're saying was like there was no such thing as science before we had, but some of the greatest scientists that we know were before this thing. Some of the greatest scientists that we know come from a time when the number of scientists in the world that you could fit in the palm of your hand if you go back far enough in time. But like, do we say that, like Da Vinci wasn't a scientist?
Mhm.
Obviously not. Like, where are his articles in Nature?
Right.
That seems kind of silly. So again, it's like, it's a thing that the more layers that you can add onto it, you know, I mean, if you actually do have credentials in a specific field, if you are peer reviewed and published in that field, if you are the guy in that field that people go to when they get into struggles, okay, fine. There's a lot of weight probably going to be given to what you said, but still, what you say has to make sense. It's
Hmm.
still not going to be true by the fact that you said it.
Yeah, it's not true just because you have some credential.
Yeah, the
And then
only
what
thing that
about
makes
people who are credentialed who disagree with each other? Like, does that undermine the value of their science? I mean, like, is it more scientific? Are ideas that are wrong more scientific because they were published?
that's the other thing too. I mean, people who haven't done any work in the field don't realize the kind of disagreements that happen on a continuous basis about methodology,
Mm.
about interpretation of data, about whether or not you should publish something, whether or not there's enough data to support the conclusion. And there's really big disagreements in science about some fundamental things. Like, it's not so much now, but you go back 20, especially 30 years ago,
Mm.
when string theory was first being developing, there was a huge group of people who thought that wasn't science. And
Yeah,
like, there was campaigns to even get it removed.
yeah.
Now it's fairly well established, and nobody really makes these arguments anymore. But there are these big contentions. And like, one of the big contentions about evolutionary biology um, is that there are a number of people arguing that the theory has become so fragmented that it's difficult to even say what the hell is the theory of evolution anymore. And there's a number of people arguing that we need to step back, take a look at this, and figure out some way to coherently describe these things in a couple of sentences or at least a paragraph. Right now, it's that fragmented that you really can't see as a coherent picture. And there's some people really fighting this. That's an open problem. Whether or not the modern synthesis needs to be redone, because there's all these
Yeah.
things that we're constantly discovering that it's influencing basically trait expression and trait inheritance. That's a real problem, and it is a real conflict that exists in modern biology.
Yeah, I've read recently a number of articles about in cosmology. Um, I think it was the multiverse, not string theory, but the multiverse was raising this issue of falsifiability. And so there are some people being critical of certain ideas because they're unfalsifiable. And then there are some cosmologists saying, well, falsifiability is not really that great of a demarcation for science. So there's kind of some movement against now falsifiability, which for a while has been considered a foundational concept of science. So that you see a back and forth here. Like, these foundational ideas are not really that foundational if they can be questioned like so easily.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that um, people can even practice science, be very well established, but they have almost no introduction to the philosophy of science.
Oh yeah.
So they learn these methodologies without really understanding what's underneath the hood and without really trying to understand like some fundamental questions.
Mm.
And one of the ones that Kuhn talked about, and the people that came after him to try to answer some of the questions, because the way Kuhn describes science
Mm.
was very different than how most people, like if you ask Steve, Steve will
Mhm.
describe science as if it's this unbiased engine that
Mhm.
rolls perfectly forward. And Kuhn was saying it's not, because
Mhm.
basically it's ran by people, and people are irrational, they're
Mhm.
emotional, they're just freaking crazy. And they're the people underneath this machine that's running it. So you'll have ideas thrown into this big machine, and people who've worked on, say, underneath a specific paradigm for 40 years all of a sudden have the idea thrown at them that, yeah, that's all wrong. Here's the way you're supposed to do it. And they're supposed to instantly flip a switch in their head and throw out all their textbooks,
Yeah.
throw out all the math. They're not going to do it.
No, not at all. That's just not how science works. Like, what I realized from familiarizing myself with Kuhn's work is that large scientific theoretical frameworks, they come with an inherent tolerance for anomalies, and even they can even tolerate a great number of anomalies so long as there is no alternative yet. So even if there is something that would normally be considered disproof of a theory, that theory will still stand as the best explanation until there's an alternative. So it has nothing to do with falsifiability. It has to do with preponderances, the preponderance of evidence and parsimony, not falsifiability.
Yeah, I mean, and again, Feynman was one of the ones who spoke about this a lot and tried to make a distinction, which is why I'm not a scientific realist. Try to make a distinction between trying to understand your observations and how to figure out what they meant and how to predict your future observations, than trying to, say, map that to the real world or universe as it exists. Because, like, when you have something like something simple like Newton's law of gravity, and very quickly, people discovered that doesn't work exactly. It doesn't even map out the planetary bodies exactly. Like, there was immediate deviations found from this, but you don't throw it out. You don't throw it out because even though you know, like, almost instantly, this doesn't map reality, but it maps a lot of our observations. And as long as things are not moving really fast, it seems to work like really well. And then we found when we looked at quantum effects that it doesn't do anything. We have no idea what's going on there. So, like, we know that law is wrong if you think about how it maps to reality. But we still use it on a daily basis to do all kinds of calculations because it's good enough to work.
Yeah. I think in Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I think he quoted Max Planck as saying, now there are two versions of the quote. One is kind of a summary of the quote, and the other is a little bit more wordy. But the summary goes something like, "Science advances one funeral at a time."
Yeah, right. When do the old paradigms shift? When all the old paradigmers are dead,
Yeah.
right? Which is essentially the way that it goes, right? Um, and that basically should tell you right away that science, as this big machine itself, isn't at any given point of time objective. What is objective is if you stand back, say a little prayer, and hope that there's enough people, new people coming into it, that are not biased to the current paradigms and can look at them objectively. Because if you just graduated and you weren't, like, heavily indoctrinated into something, you probably don't care. So you're just going to pick whichever paradigm tends to have the least amount of holes in it. It's easy enough to use and has greatest predictive power. And that's how you get advancement, from this constant influx of new people. Like, if people lived forever and people lived like elves, thousands, 5,000 years, science would be horrible. Because you'd still have
Yeah.
these, like, 10,000-year-old people fighting all the new ideas all the way down. Like,
Yeah.
this controversy that, like, sometimes Nephilim Free will take to the extreme, where he says, like, it's impossible to get a published papers to falsify evolution. Okay, that's not right. But there is a pressure, real pressure that exists, that it's much easier to push a paper through that basically confirms a very popular theory than something that, and one of the things that's really difficult to do and you really got to be careful about, is contradicting someone else's results. Like, that comes, like, with a really big backlash. So I'm not saying that it's like it's prohibited, but there is a bias for towards confirmation and against rejection. It's a real thing.
Yeah. I mean, what I hear all the time is science is perfectly objective. You touched on this already. But this assumes that scientists only have are a single motive, which is objective truth. But that's not true. They have a lot of competing motives, just like every other human being on the planet. Like, they want to be right. That's one thing. They want to get paid, so they have a profit motive. Who knows? There could be political motives. There are any number of competing motives within any one individual. So I just don't see how you can say that science is purely objective. And it's not just like on an individual level, but it can be on a journal level. There are many levels at which bias can exist. So you have to be really careful not to just assume that everything is completely pure as the wind-driven snow.
It would be absolutely ridiculous, right? Like, again, it's you can. I think it's a great method, and it's one that's constantly improving because people are asking those questions. I think the problem comes when people don't ask those questions. They read something in an article and they don't take a critical eye to it. They don't look at the authors. They don't look at the funding. They don't look at how they're actually doing the work. And they just say, okay, this is the abstract, this is the conclusion, we know the answer now.
Well, basically, a lot of times, basically, people outsource the actual intellectual heavy lifting to somebody else because it's in the journal. So they outsource the intellectual heavy lifting to the journal, or they're outsourcing it to some credentialed person because of their credential, but they're not actually thinking about it for themselves. I had when my daughter was born, my second daughter, there were some issues with that pregnancy. And we were told a bunch of things, and these people are the experts, but there were certain things that didn't really add up quite right in my head. And at the end of the day, all of these people who are experts, maybe one of them understood what we were saying, and we turned out to be correct about the issues we thought were going on. But they're what I realized was that all of these doctors and medical professionals, they are each of them in their bubble of routines and ways of thinking about things. Like, they've got checklists in their heads and all of these things. And the only person that has all the information is you. And so it's I cannot rely on the authority of somebody else. I have to know for myself. That's what I learned, is I have to understand the situation for myself.
Yeah, and you're supposed to, right? Like, if there's anything fundamental about science, that's it.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be that way, right? You're supposed to be able to question it. Like, um, I'm really strong against the concept of authority. Like, I got into it with Art one time when he was saying that there are valid appeals to authority. And I was like, there's never a valid appeal to authority. Like, you should never accept something because an authority tells you it. You accept something if an authority can actually provide warrant for what they say. If they can't provide warrant, like, why do you bring your car to a mechanic? Because your mechanic understands how to fix your car. If you were to ask the mechanic and he told you something, and you were asked the mechanic about that, and he showed no understanding of what he just said. Like, you said, man, do you even know where, like, the tires are in my car? And he pointed to the hood. Like, would the fact that he was a mechanic, you'd have no confidence in that then. It didn't matter what he had under, what certificates he had. Wouldn't matter if he was in a garage. If you asked him, dude, like, do you even know where the tires are? And he goes, tires, yeah. And he points to the hood. Assuming, like, you're speaking English and he's speaking English, at that point, it goes out the window.
Yeah. There is an article that I saw. It's called "Why Too Much Evidence Can Be a Bad Thing," and I think, if I understood it right,
Yeah, someone sent it
think
to me a couple of days ago. It's really fascinating.
yeah, the closer you get to unanimity on a certain topic or whatever, the less certain you can be. Like, there's a range where you are too close to being unanimous in the opinion. And that's where it suggests there's some bias that occurs somewhere.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is, like, that's not conjecture, right? Like, that's actually based on actual scientific methodology where they look at
Yeah.
the actual outcomes. And it's quite interesting. And, like, the explanation for it essentially boils down to the fact that there's always two competing hypotheses, right? And, like,
Mm-hmm.
one competing hypothesis is that when you have, like, say, witnesses identify somebody, the one hypothesis is, well, they are actually identifying them. Like when they all say that, like dude number two did it or whatever the hell it is, it's because he did it. There's another hypothesis though too. The other hypothesis is that there's something about that individual that makes him feel or look guilty to all of those people. So, like, imagine, for example, somebody that had like a nervous twitch that whenever because they sometimes they ask you to say something, right? Like that, that's some or whatever. Whenever
Mm-hmm.
he said something, he looked down because he had a twitch or whatever it was. People often associate that with being guilty. Like if you can't
Yeah.
look someone in the eye.
Uh-huh.
So this guy who had that sort of twitch, they could pick that guy out.
Yeah, I have that problem too. Like my thing is if I'm being accused of something, I start to get like perma smile on my face, like, no, dude, I swear. And it makes me look terribly guilty.
Yeah.
But it's just the way that like I am. Like my facial expressions just do that. When I'm being accused of something. It's probably like a nervous kind of a thing, but I totally look guilty even when I'm not. Like, there's an alternative hypothesis there, even if the main hypothesis seems self-evident. There's still a valid alternative there.
The interesting thing to me is that right after someone sent that to me, I was thinking about the fact that you see that on G Plus all the time. And one of the ways that it came to me quite obvious that this is happening is you'll get a room full of people. Um, say the people who are arguing about the creationists or whatever, those type of guys, and they will have almost instantaneous and uniform agreement, and it will like grow right down the panel, like six, five, or could be sometimes almost the entire panel, eight people will just say yes in agreement with an idea. And when people do that, it's much more likely that they're not thinking about what's going on, that they're just agreeing because they're supposed to be disagreeing with this guy because he's an idiot creationist. So when you get this uniform agreement, the first thing that comes to my mind is they're not thinking about what they're saying at all. Like that uniform agreement indicates nothing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as like group think. That experiment, oh man, what are they called? There's a certain name for them, where you've got a group of people and unbeknownst to the subject, these people are all told to say something that's obviously wrong, or like answer a question in an obviously wrong way. And most of the time the subject will go along with everybody else's answer just to be part of the group, even though the question is obviously wrong. Like they'll have a line or something and say, is this a line or is it a circle? And everybody in the room will say, oh, it's obviously a circle. And then that person will start, the subject will second guess their rational faculties and say, I'm just going to put down it's a circle. So sometimes when there's a group of people all saying the same thing, it's not even that they're just being lazy, but there's a social pressure there. That's another influence. It's real influence on opinions.
Yeah, I mean, these are real factors like that can't be just trivially ignored. I mean, we are social creatures. It's a rare individual, like almost bordering on like a sociopath, who doesn't care about other people's opinion of them at all, or how that influences the way that they live. So most people but most people don't get upset if you agree with them. Like unless Seamus when he's looking for a fight. Um, most people are perfectly cool. Like one of the easiest ways to calm someone down is to agree with them. But a lot of people, if you say, no, I don't think that's right, especially if you say it frankly, will have a very defensive reaction to it. So, like, you're in a room and 10 people have just said, like, okay, whatever. And you're going to be like, no, dude, all of you are wrong. Because you're going to start second guessing yourself and thinking, like, is it more likely that, like, all of them are wrong? Or, like, did I just not hear the question right? Did he
Right.
ask about the circle or the line? Did I get that? Were we supposed to say which one wasn't a circle? Like, what the
Right.
hell? That's what happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that just annoys me when I'm trying to I'm scouring the internet for some good conversation taking place in these hangouts, and all that people want to talk about is, oh, it's not real science, and they never actually get around to talking about the actual topic that they think someone's wrong about. They just talk about why a person isn't qualified, or why an idea isn't qualified to like for some label, as though it matters, as though it tells us anything about whether the idea is true. It's like, I don't have time for that, so I started my own hangout. And
It's
now we're talking about them talking about a demarcation.
yeah, it's unfortunate that people take those really hard lines.
But it's an
Yeah,
important conversation that we're having, though.
yeah. One of the things that struck me as really interesting when I can't remember whose conversation I was listening to the other day. I think it may be an offshoot of some comments that Matt was saying, where he was ranting on about science and what it was and what it wasn't and all that kind of stuff, and and a bunch of things about design. And it suddenly struck me, like, we're almost approaching the point. Okay, we're not there yet, but it's not like completely and utterly, like, beyond the realm of doubt that we could be in a position where we might be able to figure out, like, how to start a universe. Like, we understand some of the ideas on a fundamental level. We understand how
Yeah.
universes could form. There's a bunch of people like Leonard Susskind who are doing really interesting work and are talking about how models can predict time flow. But now, okay, so let's just think about this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
uh, if we make a universe, right? It's not that unlikely to think about, if we can make a universe, couldn't we design a universe at that stage? Well, then, couldn't you ask questions like what universes would look like that we designed? There's nothing supernatural about that at all.
No, not at all. I mean, let's go further than that. Does that make us God?
Yeah, so, like, when people ask the question, you can't talk about if the universe was designed because that's supernatural, and science doesn't deal with the supernatural. Okay, let's forget about the point about arguing over what it means to say something is supernatural or not. It's not that far-fetched for the situation I described, and there's no way anyone could argue that that wasn't science, because you're talking about, like, what a universe would be like if we made it. And can't you then ask a question, which is like, is the universe that we're in, does that seem like a universe that somebody made, like us? If we were going to make a universe, does it seem like the universe that we're in would be like that? Like, would we make a universe that had no laws, like everything was completely chaotic? Like, I don't think that's an unreasonable question. I don't think it's a useless question to ask either.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But I like see I don't really like the semantic arguments, but I think they're the easiest arguments to make because some things that are said are so nonsensical. Like I feel like the word God is it's really indistinguishable from the word alien in a lot of ways, if you think about it. Because all it means is that there's just some kind of conscious entity that has power over at least some aspect of reality. I think that's one of the most basic things you can say about God. So if we did something like creating a universe, why are we not God then? you know
Yeah. And are we supernatural then?
exactly. Oh, because we exist in a different universe, so we supersede the natural laws of that universe we just created.
I never thought about that till you brought it up. And I don't know if you came up with that idea or not, but I think it's rather neat because, like, I was pretty okay. I never really cared much for the supernatural and natural distinction. I didn't really think about, like, and I had this conversation with Matt Bell, and he was like, "You can't do science without assuming the supernatural doesn't exist." And I was like, "Well, I beg to differ. With 20 years of experience working in the field, I never assumed it, and I did science, and you didn't. So, um, pretty sure you're wrong." Um, but you said, well, like, what about somebody that's outside our universe in another universe where the laws are different? Um, and I was like, shit, that's like natural to them, but supernatural to us. So what the hell does that distinction mean anymore? I thought it was a really cool point.
Yeah, exactly. Like the distinction to me is not real. Well, it can be, but most of the time when people define the word supernatural, it's either incoherent. Like one guy, I think it was Steve, he says God is supernatural, but the universe is everything that exists, and God exists outside of the universe because he's supernatural. So basically, he was saying the supernatural and God exist outside everything that exists. So it's completely incoherent.
I don't know what you
And
mean by existing.
yeah, exactly. So it's either incoherent or it's inconsistent. Like some people will define the supernatural as that which exists outside of our local universe. So in a multiverse, we're one of countless other universes. So, but then the word supernatural then is not applied to other universes that may exist. It's only applied to God. And I'm like, why? That's inconsistent. To be consistent, like if we were to create a universe, the only coherent definition, which is the one that where supernatural is anything that exists outside of your universe, to be consistent, you'd have to say that we are supernatural now because we are outside of this universe that we just created. That's the only somewhat useful definition I've ever heard of supernatural.
Yeah, it's totally dependent on perspective.
Yeah, it's honestly, even that definition, what it means to be supernatural is relative. It's not absolute.
Yeah.
So, and nevertheless, people will use this as a demarcation criterion for science, which is the most absurd one that I hear. Yet it's like strangely common and pervasive, but it's completely incoherent. It makes me wonder, like, there's got to be some kind of a bias there, like some kind of prejudice against theism or religion. There's this idea that it's all just kind of stupid or whatever, and that's what drives people to say the supernatural can't be studied by science or something like. I don't know. It boggles my mind. I haven't figured it out. I just
Yeah.
know it doesn't make sense.
That's like really ridiculous. I mean, like, I don't know why people say stuff like that. Like, when people say, the only thing I would say to this is I don't know what you mean by some of the words that you're saying in that point. This is the friendliest thing that I can say to you. Like, if you're describing, say, a god, okay? Now, let's say your god does not interact with our universe at all. Then I could say it would be very difficult to know anything about your god because it doesn't interact with the universe. So how could I get any information about it? So I could say yes. We couldn't learn anything about your God from science. I don't think we can learn anything about your God at all because there's no interaction going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say we have a God that interacts with our universe. Well, then I think that you can learn about that God. You can learn about where he's interacting. You can learn about when he's interacting. You can learn about the effects of the interactions. You could even learn about if they're chaotic or if they're patterned. You can obviously get information from them from
I mean,
observing the world.
if there's a causal chain there, what stops us a priori from tracing that chain backwards. You know, if this God uh, has effects on the universe, why can we not look at those effects and trace them back through their causal lineage? What is the a priori rule that prevents us from doing that?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I mean, like we have done this. I mean, like the prayer studies, many supernatural things outside of God, where people try to determine things like dowsing and all these other kind of things, where people claim to have supernatural abilities. Like, I don't understand. Like, it doesn't even seem complicated to me to say that you can't study that. And one of the other things that gets me is that there's a huge part of science that doesn't even care about causes at all. That's the really thing that freaks me out. Like when someone like Matt or especially Steve, he says like, you can't consider supernatural causes, and I'm like, dude, do you realize like 50% of science doesn't even care about causes? It's just about cataloging shit. The bulk of science is just about making a bunch of observations and figuring out what the pattern is. There's a huge amount of this that goes on, and then once you have this enormous wealth of data, then theoreticians sit down and look at it and say, okay, like what's the underlying mathematical model? And then once that gets done, someone looks at the mathematical model and says, what does all this gibberish mean? Like, what the hell is going on with this math? But that's a layered stage. So, like, you could forget about, you could do experiments on dowsing just to see if people could actually do it. And then if you figured out they actually could do it and it was a repeated observable, then you would start thinking about, okay, well, what's actually the cause of it? But you have to get that data first. And that collection, that designing of experiments, that performing the experiments is obviously science, but you're not even thinking about the cause. You don't even care about the cause. You just got to get the data in first.
Sorry, I had some company. Yeah. Um. So here's the other thing. Like, as a theist, people accuse you all the time of being the science stopper, but what are these demarcation people doing if not stopping science from studying certain categories of causes? Like, I don't know.
And
It's arbitrary too. Like,
yeah, and again, a lot of these things, like when I hear people saying, I don't understand what they're talking about, like at all, because so when you work in the lab, and me and you are working, and we see some observation, doesn't know what it is. We're not trying to figure out, okay, how do we explain this thing? There's no like science police that comes in and says, okay, Brandon Cliff, what are you proposing? No, you're not allowed to look at those things. It doesn't happen, right? Like you just start thinking about what could be causing it. And sometimes you can't think on anything. So you go talk to the other people that work in your field. You wander around, you read a book, you go watch a movie, you try to get inspired to come up with stuff. You listen to wacky things, you do word association, you try to figure stuff out. Because a lot of stuff breaks all the time. It just goes around here trying to problem solve. Like science is not this big glorious thing all the time. Um, and so like if somebody came in to me and proposed something supernatural, I would be like, no, I can't study that. I'd be like, okay, so what are you saying? Leprechauns did it? Okay, so what the hell? What are the properties of leprechauns?
Right.
That's all I would ask him, right? Like if somebody told me, oh yeah, I come from Ireland, yeah, leprechauns do exactly what you're saying,
Hmm.
and that's what I would do. Like, and so
But the thing is, it would be within the realm of possibility that you would discover leprechauns. And
yeah,
these studies have been done on the supernatural. Forget whatever the results are supposed to say, or whatever the results were. The point is, uh, it was within the realm of possibility that these experiments that have taken place could have shown a supernatural effect.
yeah, like look at the intercessory prayer studies. There were some studies done on this that were quite interesting because of the way that they were done. Because, for example, some of the things are very interesting where people who knew they were getting prayed for often had negative results, and they think one of the reasons that's going on is that when people find out other people are praying for them, they're like, "Holy shit, I must be in bad shape now." So they can force themselves. But you can also like do randomized trials where groups of people pray for people who don't even know they're getting prayed for. Now, let's just imagine that this starts showing really strong positive correlation. How the hell do you explain that naturally? Like, that just seems to be whacked out. So, what would the result be if that showed a really strong positive correlation? And let's imagine it that you could show a really strong positive correlation, for example, when they prayed to the Christian God, when they followed, like, I don't even know enough about the Bible to know if you're supposed to pray in certain ways or whatever the hell it is. Or, okay, let's make it really specific. Let's say Islam, because I know Islam is like really regimentized. So you had like the more that they followed, the actual, okay, 4 days, look at the West or wash yourself, the more they followed the ritual, the stronger the healing got. Like, isn't that okay, forget about isn't that obviously evidence that something is going on there that seems to be linked to this? Like, how could anyone look at that and say, no, that's not evidence for a supernatural? Like, it seems to be. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you just dismiss it, it would seem to me you got a massive bias. You're not even
Yeah,
thinking about it objectively.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, people say that science can't study the supernatural, but there have been experiments set up specifically to study the supernatural. Like if it wasn't possible that science would test and even discover the supernatural, then it's not a real experiment.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? The thing that gets me is like that was one of the really big things about ID. And I think one of the problems that the guys did themselves in is they opened themselves up because people would say things like, well, you're just arguing for God. And they went to try to get around that, and of course, wouldn't openly deal with the question. And it was always this big hidden underskirt that people would come out and reveal as if it was the grand hammer, and they would discuss everything to that. And my response to that, if I was making an argument for ID, would be like, I'm not thinking about the cause at this stage. I'm just trying to see whether or not we can establish that the fact that there is a design. I'm doing the first part of it. Remember when we do science in the lab, there's 3 stages. We figure out the pattern, we do some math, we get a model, and then we physically try to interpret the model. I'm still at stage 1. You're jumping to stage 3. We don't do that. We had to do 1, 2, and 3. I don't know why you're going to 3 yet. We still haven't got out of 1. So let's actually do science here. So let's get to the first stage. That's the way I would approach that.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes some of them do make a similar statement. They say that the identity of the designer is peripheral to the design inference itself, which I think is kind of similar to what you're saying. Like,
Yeah, 'cause it's
it's an earlier,
unfortunate. Yeah, it's
like you'd have to
unfortunate
go a
that they make it.
stage beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, they make it all about God. Like, and none of them really discuss the question. Like, because there's 2 different questions. One question is, can you ask a question about God in science? And that's an interesting question. And there's another question is, can you infer design? And they're 2 different questions, but it's harder to make the case for you can talk about God because it's so controversial. And the problem is there's a lot of crazy wingnuts that say a lot of crazy things. And when you say stuff that's similar to them, you get lumped in with them. So it's
Yeah.
unfortunate because, and this is where like people argue science is unbiased, and it's not. So
Mhm.
when you're up there saying like, yeah, I'm going to do an experiment, and it's about, it has a supernatural cause on the end. Yes, I believe God is the designer and whatever, whatever. And you get lumped into this box that has all these crazy people who are like screaming about stuff, and people are like saying, "Oh, that's what you are. So you're not a scientist. You're just one of those dudes," which
Yeah.
is like a really racist thing to say,
Yeah,
essentially.
pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, the same idea. I mean, you're prejudiced against a certain category. Yeah. Um, one of the things that the ID people were saying, or first of all, one of the criticisms was in one of their books, they used some creationist language, like they used the word creationist, which kind of made sense because it was an alternative to the materialist view at that time. It was kind of the jargon of the time. But what they say is you have to look at whether the arguments they were making were the same arguments as the biblical creationists. And they weren't. They're not the same. So what they're saying is look at the content. But the problem is that people get so caught up in the labels that are used instead of the content of those labels, the content of the argument. And people think that they can just dismiss something because they call it a creationist view or because they call it supernatural, but then they haven't actually looked at the argument. But I would even go a little bit further than that. What if we could prove that God exists, right? Now, the whole Dover thing back in 2005, that was all centered around this idea of education. What should we teach in public schools? What should we not teach in public schools? So let's say that we proved absolutely the existence of God. Would we not be allowed to teach this proven fact in public schools? Just because it's God we're talking about, even though it's a proven fact?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like what happens if these intercessory prayer studies actually show strong positive correlations?
Right. Can you begin to teach that prayer works in public schools? It's a fact, if that was a fact. Or would you be prevented from teaching objective facts because you've labeled them religious?
Yeah, and that's where like the definition I have of some of these terms gets me into conflicts with like Matt and Steve and a few other people, where I would say science is by definition the method which allows us to learn and make inferences from our observations in a reliable manner. That's all science is. There's nothing more to that. Whatever the method is that does that is by definition something I would call scientific. So, and the results of that method are part of science. So, if those intercessory prayer experiments, um, even if they failed, regardless of whether or not they failed or if they succeeded, they're still part of science. If they fail, they just show that it doesn't look like there's evidence for it from what we can tell now. If they succeed and it says, well, it looks like there is evidence, but either way, they're part of science. And studying them is part of science because we're trying to understand our
Mhm.
observations and make inferences about it.
Yeah. What's wrong with that? What in the world is wrong with that? I mean, here, I think there's kind of a two-facedness here because people will tout around some of these studies saying, see, I told you prayer didn't work, without even realizing they just admitted that science studied the supernatural just now.
Yeah.
Like, do you realize you just admitted science studied the supernatural?
That's an interesting question, though. I never thought about it till you asked it. What would happen if we started seeing positive results in these things would the same people say that they shouldn't actually put them in the classroom? If they did, it would almost be crazy. Like, I don't even know what science would mean if you would say no at that point.
Really? Yeah. Or what education would mean.
Like, what would you tell them? You got two choices at that point. You tell them it don't work, which means you lie, or you hide the results and pretend nothing happened, which isn't a lot better.
Yeah. Which I would say, by your definition, is anti-scientific.
It would be like I'd consider it horrible if someone. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I was trying to. I couldn't get this across to Matt Bell, but I only have so much patience for talking to that dude anyway. And he was saying like, well, you can't. He was ranting the same thing about you from a day later. That was a holdover from when I had a conversation with him the day before. And he's like saying, you have to assume there's no such thing as a supernatural because you will never get anywhere. And I was like, Matt, the problem that you're saying, the problem that you think happens is that like if you assume the supernatural, then there's like all these supernatural things that you have to conclude. He's like, yeah, right, there is. And I'm like, Matt, that's not how science works because there's an infinite number of natural possibilities as well. Well, you don't get stymied by the fact that there's all these possible things because there's like an infinite number of natural laws that you could say we just haven't discovered yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe it is the case that X and Y cause Z. Maybe all these things are the case. But you don't keep postulating every single one of them and testing them. But how come science still progresses in the fact of this infinite number of things which could influence our results? So simply because we add another infinity to it doesn't make it that much worse because we had an infinite number to start off with. So making it even more infinite doesn't make it worse because it was, if from your point of view, it would never have got anywhere in the first place. But we don't, of course. Like you can still look at it. Like when you're trying to figure out explanations for stuff, like how do you come up with a hypothesis? And like Matt even said something crazy today, like, well, they're just guesses. And they're like, they're just guesses. That's what you think happens. Like, so me and Brandon are in the lab and we observe something and we just go over to a random number generator and it says, make an estimate. And it says, investigate this. That's not how it works, dude. Like, you would never get anywhere if they were just random.
No. Yeah. That's why I create my own hangouts, because otherwise go down the rabbit trail.
What was your or how do you feel about Joe's divine hiddenness argument that he's been running recently? You've got a rather unique concept of God, so
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if there's anything that would entail like from that.
Well, my point of view on that argument is really simple. It's not an argument against theism. It's an argument against specific religions, because it assumes that God would do certain things if he exists, but this assumes a character of God, and that's religiously specific. That's not specific to theism generally. So I don't think if you're arguing against just the idea of theism that the argument's going to stand at all. Because you can simply say, well, I don't think God's like that, and the argument's over.
Yeah, like a lot of Calvinists will just do that. They'll just say, well, I mean, Joe, like there really isn't a problem. Like if you want to know, like how come God doesn't have a relationship with you, it's because he hates you. That's all a Calvinist will say.
Yeah.
Game over.
Well, yeah. I mean, I kind of made that argument too when we actually discussed it for the first time, because there are passages where, God outright rejects somebody before, and it doesn't depend on that person at all. It just rejects them, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything the person did. They didn't earn this rejection. He just, God just did it. There are passages about that, and so if God's gonna outright reject somebody for no reason, then how is it a stretch to think that God would just, ignore people for no reason?
Yeah, that's why it's a very interesting argument in some cases, but like you said, it's arguing against a very specific type of God. It's similar to
And I
when,
wouldn't even say it accurately describes the Christian God. So I wouldn't even say
yeah,
you'd really use it against Christianity.
that's where it gets controversial because like there's a relatively fragmented view on the Christian God. Like it doesn't work at all about like if you try to run it against James North, who's an open theist. And for example, James's God doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. So the future, because the future doesn't exist according to James's view of the universe. So you can easily explain why there are non-resistant non-believers, because like God doesn't know sort of what you're going to do. Like God knows from James's point of view, like God can solve any math equation that you can put in front of them.
Right.
But like if me and God are sitting down at a table and there's two cards in front of me, a king and a queen, and you say, God, which card is Cliff going to pick? He's like, oh, I have no idea, dude. That dude's crazy. That's James's view of God. So you can understand how that God might not be able to have relationships with people because he's tried. And their people's free will choices lead them away. He's given it an honest effort. He's made attempts to communicate with them people, but he doesn't know what their free will choices will be. He doesn't know what they're going to do. So it's very easy for them to explain non-resistant non-believers.
Yeah, and I mean the most you can say is that it's a challenge to the idea of a non-deistic kind of God. Like it's an argument that challenges the idea of a God that cares oh so much about us, you know. But it's a logical disproof of God generally. No, definitely not. A logical disproof of the Christian God, definitely not. I don't think.
Yeah, I think it's in its strongest form when you run it against somebody who uses the classical omnimax properties of God
Yeah.
and who hasn't thought about them very much.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it becomes hard to try to understand, well, how does a God that knows everything, can do everything, loves 100%, not have a relationship with somebody? That seems
Yeah.
hard to understand.
Yeah, that's a much stronger argument. Um, but definitely not a disproof. You have to. I think if Joe wants to make that argument, he's gotta go the moral direction with it. I don't. Well, I don't know if moral's the right word, but that's the closest thing I could think of. But definitely not as a disproof of God. But I think that's what he's trying to sell it as.
I don't know what you mean by like the moral route exactly.
Like, if God could save everybody or whatever, then it would be immoral for him not to, if he can do it. Or maybe moral's the wrong word, but you have to take. You have to. It has to be framed as an argument against a quality of God, not the existence of God, like a characteristic of God's personality or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's the cleanest understanding of it that I've seen. That it's arguing that characteristics of God could not be held. Some particular group of them. Like you could have an all knowing and all powerful God who didn't have relationships. You could have an all powerful and all loving God who didn't have relationships. Yeah, I think that's relatively cool. I think that's the shortest, concisest overview of that argument I've seen I've heard yet.
Yeah, I think it's an argument over the character of God. It's not an argument over the existence of God. That's the way I see it. Although I think no, there's the Epicurean argument, if I'm saying that word right, where there are a series of propositions like if God's so good, then he wouldn't do this, or if God's all powerful, then he would do this. And there's like three of them, and it's very similar to Joe's argument. Um, and William Lane Craig had a response to it, and it's you add an additional proposition God has morally sufficient reasons for doing things the way that he does them. And it's kind of funny. It's almost cheating a little bit, but it's funny because, yeah, you can't say that that's not true. You can't disprove that proposition.
Yeah, the only problem I have with that, and I've discussed this with Seamus a couple of times, I think if you take that approach, I think you put yourself in a position where you can't know anything about God's moral character, even if you knew all of God's actions, which seems weird. Because, like,
Well,
you know,
um, yeah, I'm not really sure. Um, I have to think about it. But I think that the crucial thing to remember, though, is William Lane Craig is not making his case for the existence of God or the character of God based on that argument. So when he responds to that, it's a defense.
yeah,
So in other words, what he's saying is um, this argument here, if I add this additional proposition, then it does not disprove these other arguments that I have for God existing and God having a certain kind of character. So I think you have to keep that in mind, that it is a defensive argument. So then you have to go on to examine the other positive arguments that he makes.
yeah, the problem I would have with that is that if you would accept that that's a valid defense in that argument, I think I could use that same line of reasoning to show that any inference that you would make about God's character morally from any other argument that you could make, I could stem it with that sort of objection.
Like you could just simply say, well, it could be something else, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's where it becomes a question of parsimony. Like, are these other positive arguments, like, are they strong enough to have a high degree of confidence in them? Can you have a higher degree of confidence in these positive arguments than you can have in this counter argument over here about the character of God? So I think that's what it depends on. Yeah, you can always say that the case could be something else, but like if we were talking about fine tuning or if we were talking about design, and your only explanatory resource is some kind of entity we would describe as God, well, then that inference still stands, I think, even if you say, well, it could be something else. Because, yeah, it could always be something else. But the fact is, we have positive reason for believing that it's this way. And so, therefore, the defense I offered over here is valid because I still have a positive argument over here, even though the case could conceivably be anything. You know, Santa Claus could exist. Santa Claus could have done everything.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing in about a lot of these debates is they stop when the conversation gets interesting to me. Like if you watch William Lane Craig's debate, his opening you've heard a million times. His first rebuttal you've heard basically a million times. The second rebuttal is where new stuff comes out and then it stops,
Right.
which to me is like
Yeah, yeah.
what I would like to have
Mhm.
debate. What I would like to see is an opening, okay,
Mhm.
from both parties, and then a direct crosstalk and interaction for the remaining periods. Because the people would immediately get past this. It almost seems to me like you're watching a chess game and we see these very, very formulaic openings for like 5 to 10 moves, and then when the chess game is just about really to start, it shuts off.
Right.
So let's
I
get past
totally
all
know
that
what you
back and
mean.
forth.
Yeah, I agree. Mhm. Yeah, like when I heard um, William Craig, when I heard him offer that defense, it was very quick, very brief, and to the point. And I so badly wanted to hear so much more about that point. I wanted to hear more elaboration on that, but it was just, a quick rejoinder. But yeah, but that's okay. We got it covered, Cliff, you and me.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna have to head out, Cliff, because it is really late for me.
No worries. Interesting talking to you as always, Brandon.
Yeah, as usual. I'll talk to you later, Cliff.
Yep.
Okay, bye.